Okay, let's unpack this one. Today, we're diving into a really interesting story pulled from some fascinating sources we've got here. Things like Radio the New Missionary, Reach Beyond, some archive stuff too. It's all about how technology, faith, and a very specific vision came together, kind of unexpectedly.
Yeah, it's quite a tale.
So our mission for this deep dive, we want to explore this journey. It starts with what the sources call a pretty clear call to go south with radio.
That specific phrase. Yeah.
And we'll track how that initial idea, blossomed into this global effort, now known as Reach Beyond. We'll pull out the key people, the big moments, and importantly, some surprisingly innovative methods these sources talk about.
And just so everyone's clear, everything we're talking about today comes directly only from the text in these sources you have.
Right.
It's a real mix, history, biography like Clarence Jones, technical bits about early radio, even portable units, and reflections on the mission, the methods over time.
So the big question for you listening is, how did this vision for just one radio station in Ecuador, how did that grow into a worldwide ministry? And what can we maybe learn from their journey about mixing innovation with a core message? Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so according to these sources, it really kicks off with Clarence Jones.
Yeah.
Where do the sources first place him? How does radio even get on his radar?
Well, the sources put him in Chicago first. He's working with Paul Rader, who was a pretty big evangelist back then.
Yeah.
Jones was involved in music, rallies, that sort of thing. But the key part for us is his work with Rader's radio broadcasts. They were on a station called WJBT.
WJBT, what did that stand for?
Get this, where Jesus blesses thousands.
Huh. Or Jesus blesses thousands. Okay, I like that. So he's already hands-on with radio.
Exactly. And this lines up directly with his own sense of calling, according to the sources.
Awesome.
Well, the sources describe him wrestling with his direction for years. Then one night, after hearing Rader, he rededicates himself to missionary service. And the sources note he wasn't someone who usually claimed, dramatic messages from God.
Right.
But shortly after this rededication, he felt he got this very specific, undeniable instruction. Arise and go south with radio.
Wow, go south with radio. That's very specific.
Incredibly specific.
But turning a vision like that into reality, well, that's usually the hard part. How did his first attempts go, according to the sources?
It was definitely not smooth sailing. The sources detail him spending 7 weeks in 1928, traveling all over Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, Cuba.
Looking for a spot.
Yeah, literally searching for the right location for what he imagined as the world's first missionary radio station.
And that search didn't pan out.
No, it didn't. He came back to Chicago empty-handed, understandably disappointed, the sources say. And maybe not surprisingly, some people he worked with thought this whole go south with radio thing was, well, a bit out there.
They doubted it?
Yeah, the sources mention it being called Jones's Folly.
Ouch.
And then, what really made things tough, the sources highlight the 1929 stock market crash. That just decimated fundraising for anything seen as risky or new, like this radio idea.
Ooh, Jones's Folly plus a market crash. That's a rough start.
Yeah.
Was he the only one thinking about this kind of thing, missionary radio? Or do the sources mention others?
That's a good question. The sources do indicate the idea wasn't totally unique to him. They mention a Walter Turnbull, who apparently had a wider vision for mission radio in several places.
Oh, where?
Specifically, the sources named the Philippines, South America, and Palestine.
Interesting.
And there's a note in the sources that the Philippines wasn't pursued then because they anticipated conflict coming, which turned out to be World War II. So Jones had his specific call south, but there was, a broader conversation happening too.
Okay, so despite the setback, the crash, the folly label, the idea for somewhere in South America didn't die. How did Jones finally find the place? What do the sources say?
Right. The story picks back up when Jones connects with 2 missionaries already based in Ecuador, Reuben Larson and Paul Young. They were with the CMA.
And they were open to the radio idea.
They were. They agreed to try and get radio work started there. And Walter Turnbull, the missions director we just mentioned, he gave his permission. That was key.
Ah, so he got the institutional backing, sort of.
Sort of. The source is clear. Turnbull said it couldn't be an official CMA project, not at first anyway.
Got it. So they have a location, Ecuador, and permission. But you can't just set up a radio station. You need government approval, right? Especially in another country. How did that work out?
Yeah, that was absolutely crucial. The sources really emphasized this step. They managed to get the license from the Ecuadorian government, August 15th, 1930.
Okay.
And a key figure here mentioned in the sources is an Ecuadorian lawyer named Luis Callisto. He was apparently instrumental in navigating all that.
And it wasn't just a simple license, was it?
No, the sources say they got a 25-year contract. And part of that deal involved committing to broadcast government programming, too.
Wow, 25 years in broadcasting government stuff. That's a serious commitment. A strategic partnership, really, from day one.
Definitely.
So what happened next, according to the sources? Jones gets the license.
Jones himself heads down to Ecuador. Left New York in August 1930. The sources describe him landing in Guayaquil first.
Okay.
And right away, a very practical problem. Hardly anyone in Ecuador actually owned a radio receiver back then.
Ah, yeah. You can broadcast all you want, but if no one can listen.
Exactly. So the sources say Jones made arrangements with some local businessmen, John and Ellen Reed, to import and sell radios. The idea was the station's programs would help create demand, drive sales. Smart.
That is smart. Addressing the market issue right away. Then what?
From Guayaquil, he headed up to Quito to start the preparations there.
And Quito is where the station got its name, or its call letters, HCJB. The sources mention something specific about those letters.
They do. The sources detail how the call letters were assigned in October 1930, and they had this intentional double meaning. In Spanish, HCJB stands for Hoy Cristo Jesus Bendice, which means Today Jesus Christ Blesses. And then in English, they used Heralding Christ Jesus Blessings.
Heralding Christ Jesus Blessings. Nice. So the name itself, baked right into the call letters, reflects the mission.
Very deliberately, it seems.
Yeah. So call letters assigned, mission clear. What did Jones do next, based on the sources?
He actually returned to the U.S. near the end of October 1930. And the sources mentioned this was a difficult period for him personally. Tragically, his close friend, Richard Oliver, died in a car accident while Jones was away. And then adding to that, when Jones got back to Chicago, he found out he'd been replaced on the staff at the Gospel Tabernacle.
Oh, wow. So a setback for the mission vision, personal tragedy, and losing his job back home, that's a lot.
Yeah, it must have been incredibly tough.
How did he respond? Do the sources show that?
They portray him as resilient. Despite being replaced, he finds a new job working with Gerald Winrod, who actually became a supporter. And Jones just kept fundraising for the transmitter they needed for Ecuador.
Kept going.
Yeah. And this whole challenging period probably just reinforced the need for a proper organizational structure for this whole radio mission.
Which led to them formally creating the organization.
Exactly. Just a few months later, March 9th, 1931, they officially incorporated the World Radio Missionary Fellowship, WRMF.
WRMF. Okay.
And the sources list the first officers and board members. Shows it was a team effort. Jones as president, Adam Welty treasurer, Ruth Churchill secretary, and then the Lathams, Howard Jones, Reuben Larson on the board.
Right, putting a formal structure in place. So they've got the organization, the location, the license, their fundraising. What's the next big move described in the sources?
Getting the actual gear to Ecuador. The sources describe Jones going back in August 1931. And this time he brought the first transmitter, 250 watts, and a radio technician, Eric Williams.
Okay, the hardware arrives. His wife, Catherine, didn't go yet.
No, the sources note she stayed in Chicago. She was pregnant at the time.
Ah, okay. And getting that transmitter to Quito, the sources make that sound like quite the adventure.
Oh, they paint a really vivid picture. They had to haul this equipment up the Andes Mountains to get to Quito.
How'd they do it?
2 days by train first. Then they had to transfer the transmitter, which was obviously precious cargo, and all the other gear, onto a truck for the last leg of the journey.
Must have been nerve-wracking.
Totally.
Yeah.
The sources mention how relieved everyone was when the transmitter finally arrived safely, sometime near Christmas 1931. You could almost feel that tension release in the writing.
Absolutely. Getting that crucial piece through all that. So it's there. What about the early days of broadcasting? Was it smooth once they flipped the switch?
Oh, far from it. The sources are really clear. They basically had to invent missionary radio as they went along. In a foreign country, no less.
Learning curve.
Huge. It wasn't just the technical stuff. It was figuring out how to make gospel programs that actually connected with the local culture. And all while constantly scrambling to find the money to just keep the lights on, keep the station running. A daily challenge, it sounds like.
Constant learning and pressure.
Which brings us to this core idea the sources really hammer home. Radio the new missionary. What was so significant about radio for them back then?
Well, the sources frame it as this incredibly powerful modern approach. They set it against traditional missionary work, which, is limited by one person's time, their physical strength.
Right, one person can only be in one place.
Exactly. But with radio, the sources say you could reach thousands, maybe millions all at once. It was seen as this massive force multiplier for the message.
Yeah, leveraging technology to break down those barriers of distance and uh, logistics. And the sources show this vision grew quickly beyond just Quito, beyond Ecuador.
You started thinking bigger.
Definitely. They
Yeah.
talk about wanting to reach all of South and Central America. They saw Ecuador as their Jerusalem and Judea, but the rest of the continent was their Samaria.
Following that biblical model of expansion. And the sources say achieving that, reaching further, required better tech, right?
Yes, they knew that 250-watt transmitter wouldn't cut it for that kind of reach. The sources mentioned a Chicago radio engineer proposing a $10,000 transmitter.
Wow, big money back then.
Huge investment. But necessary if they wanted that wider coverage. And it's around this time, as they start aiming further out, that the station gets its famous nickname, the Voice of the Andes.
The Voice of the Andes, okay.
And the sources also get into some of the technical stuff needed for that wider reach. They talk about shortwave versus long-wave frequencies. What do they say about why shortwave was the key?
Yeah, this part's fascinating. The sources explain that, and it might sound backwards to us today. Shortwave was actually the way to go for long distances. Longwave was better just locally.
Right.
And mastering shortwave meant understanding all these complex things that affected the signal, international rules about radio spectrum, but also like natural stuff.
Exactly. The sources mention things like the sun, the exact frequency they used, the angle the waves hit the atmosphere, even the 11-year sunspot cycle.
The sunspot cycle, seriously.
Yeah. Which apparently meant they had to change broadcast frequencies sometimes, depending on the time of day or the season, just to keep the signal clear for listeners far away. It really shows the level of technical skill and constant adaptation needed.
That is incredible, especially for that time. But it wasn't just about the main transmitter tower, right? The sources talk about them getting really creative out in the field, too. Tell us about the radio rodante.
Ah, the radio rodante, or traveling radio.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the coolest examples in the sources of their innovative boots-on-the-ground approach.
What was it exactly?
It was basically a custom-built bus, a studio on wheels, designed specifically for what they called highway evangelism.
A studio on wheels. Driving around the Andes in the 30s or 40s, that sounds pretty wild. What did it have on board?
The sources give a great description. It had its own generator for power, a portable transmitter, it's cool, that could actually communicate back to the main station in Quito up to about 100 miles away.
Wow, two-way communication.
Yeah. Plus a microphone, turntables for playing records or messages, and 2 big loudspeakers mounted right on the roof.
The loudspeakers on the roof.
And the sources point out, it was the only portable transmitter the government allowed in the whole country. It had a special permit directly from the president.
The only one.
Right.
That implies the government maybe saw some value in it, too. Or its purpose.
Seems likely. And how they used it was just as creative, according to the sources.
How so?
Well, they'd drive it into remote villages, crank up the loudspeakers, and naturally, it would draw a big crowd.
I bet.
They'd use it for broadcasts, public address, and get this. They'd string up a big bed sheet, set up a movie projector, and show films.
Films. On a bus. In a remote village.
Yeah. The sources mentioned showing things like a travelogue about the Panama Canal. Apparently, the government liked this aspect too, saw it as a form of education for people in isolated areas.
That's amazing. What kind of crowds did it draw?
Really diverse crowds, the sources say. People from all walks of life. Descriptions mention everything from folks in their finer clothes to people in traditional, colorful ponchos. A real cross-section.
So this radio rodante really shows something key from the sources, doesn't it? They weren't just passive broadcasters.
Not at all. They were actively finding ways to take the message, and even things like films, to the people where they lived, using whatever tech, whatever devices they could adapt for that context.
That adaptability, that willingness to literally go to where people are, that's powerful.
Yeah.
And the sources stress this ministry wasn't just about the voice of radio, right? They talk about the hands, too.
Yes, absolutely. The sources highlight this balance as core to their whole philosophy, serving the whole person.
Meaning
They felt the ministry needed to combine the spiritual teaching, the voice, with practical help, like physical healing, the hands. The sources actually frame this as following Jesus's pattern. Teach, heal, teach, heal.
So not just words, but deeds. How did they integrate that from the start?
Well, the sources say that right alongside setting up the radio work, they integrated medical care. Pretty early on, a clinic was established in Quito. It later grew into a hospital.
When did that start?
Shortly after, a Dr. Roberts and a nurse named Herb arrived. according to the sources. And this clinic, then hospital, apparently became really important for healthcare in that whole area.
A tangible community benefit. Now, the sources also mention a really interesting strategic move much later concerning that hospital, around 2010.
Yes, that was a big decision described in the sources. By that time, healthcare in Ecuador had generally improved a lot over the decades.
So they didn't need the hospital as much.
Well, they made the strategic choice to sell the hospital in Quito. And the reason the sources give is compelling. They wanted to shift those resources, that energy, to parts of the world where healthcare systems were still really lacking.
Redeploying assets to where the need was greatest.
Exactly. The sources mention places like Nepal, Ghana, Sierra Leone as examples of where they refocused medical efforts. And they continue that work. The sources share stories like medical teams helping someone named Zacharias in Malawi, or responding after the Haiti earthquake, helping people like Wadleen.
That's a powerful example of adapting strategy over time based on changing needs globally. And this balance, this voice and hands idea, it continues today, often using technology.
Absolutely. The sources talk about the ongoing work of the HCJB Global Technology Center. It gives technical help worldwide, but it also develops specific tools.
Like what?
Like the transmitter in a suitcase we talked about earlier, which helps the voice, but also things like a portable, solar-powered lab-in-a-suitcase.
A lab in a suitcase. For what?
Specifically for medical work in remote areas, supporting the hands. It shows how technology serves both sides of that coin for them.
Another great example of adapting tech for hard-to-reach places. Now, another big theme the sources keep bringing up is partnership. Clarence Jones himself had something to say about that.
He did. The sources quote him directly. God never asked me to do a job, but that there essence them. He sent along men to help me do it.
So partnership was baked in from the beginning.
Seems like it. Early on, the sources mentioned partnerships with other mission groups, and of course that significant partnership with the Ecuadorian government, giving them 20% of their airtime.
That 20% is a big commitment. How do the sources describe their partnership approach now?
The current model, as laid out in the sources, really emphasizes starting with an invitation. They work with overseas ministries or local partners. They don't just decide things back at headquarters and impose them.
So locally driven.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And the sources point to early examples of this collaborative spirit, like the World Conference on Missionary Radio, which eventually became the International Christian Broadcaster. So a history of working together.
And the sources also seem to really emphasize empowering local people, local leaders. Why is that so important in their view?
Well, the sources argue strongly that local believers are usually the most effective people to share the message in their own communities, especially in unreached areas.
Makes sense.
And they give some really compelling examples from their experience. Church planters in Indonesia starting 50 radio stations with their help. Partners in a Buddhist country using radio alongside community events. Stories of listeners becoming believers and then sharing radios or the message themselves.
Any specific stories?
Yeah, they mention a former witch doctor named Hassan and a Muslim woman who then introduced her friends to the faith after hearing broadcasts. These kinds of personal stories really illustrate the impact of empowering locals, according to the sources.
Those are powerful anecdotes. But despite all this work, all the innovation over decades, the sources are also pretty blunt about the scale of the task remaining, aren't they?
Oh yeah, very frank. The sources state clearly that even with all the efforts worldwide, billions of people still haven't heard the Christian message in a way they can really understand it.
What kind of numbers do they cite?
They mention figures like 2.5 billion people, which they calculate is about 42% of the world's population lacking a clear understanding of Jesus from their perspective.
2.5 billion, that's a staggering.
It is. And the sources connect this huge number to a concept they call the 2% solution.
The 2% solution, what's that?
It's presented less as a simple fix and more as a way to think about tackling that immense challenge. The idea, based on the sources, is that if every Christian believer does something, even a small part, maybe 2% of their effort or resources towards reaching the unreached,
then that huge number starts to look a bit more achievable.
Exactly. It frames the scale, but also offers a path forward, suggesting collective small actions can make a big difference. That's the idea presented.
The 2% solution. Interesting way to frame it, coming from the sources. Now, this whole evolution from one station in Ecuador to this global focus on billions of unreached people that led to a major change mentioned in the sources, the organization's name.
That's right. In 2013, the sources explain, HCJB Global officially became Reach Beyond.
Why the change?
The reasoning given in the sources is pretty clear. They recognized the ministry had become much more than the ministry with a station in Ecuador.
They'd outgrown the original name.
Essentially,
Yeah.
yes. And Latin America, where they started, is now seen by them as largely a reached continent. So that allowed a strategic shift of focus and resources globally. The name Reach Beyond is meant to reflect that current focus, reaching the unreached, looking worldwide, doing something new and vital tomorrow, as the sources phrase it.
Makes sense. The name reflects the broadened mission. And technology's role in all this today, what do the sources say?
Technology is still vital, the sources emphasize. But they're careful about how they frame it.
How so?
They state clearly it's a tool, not the answer. It is only a means of telling people the answer. That's a direct quote.
So the message is the key. The tech is just the delivery system.
Precisely. They stay open to new things.
Mhm.
The sources mention FM radio, older text, obviously digital tech today. But the focus remains on the message and the human connection, not the gadgetry itself.
The means, not the end. Okay. One last the sources use this really interesting analogy for the connection between supporters back home and the people working in the field.
Yeah, the spiritual logistics analogy.
Right. Tell us about that.
They use a military supply chain metaphor. Just like an army needs reliable logistic supplies, equipment to succeed on the front lines, missionary work needs its own supply chain. The home front, meaning Christians supporting the work, provides the spiritual logistics, the people, the equipment, the funding needed by the missionaries and local partners out in the field to actually do the work. That it connects the two sides.
That's a vivid way to put it. Essential support system.
So when you look back at everything the sources lay out, it's quite a journey. From one man's specific call through failure, loss, innovation, like that mobile studio,
Right.
balancing the voice and hands, building partnerships globally, and finally evolving into this worldwide network focused on reaching people who haven't heard. It's a story of vision, definitely, but also resilience and constant adaptation.
And the sheer depth and length of this work. It's underlined by that mention in the sources of the Clarence W. Jones Papers collection. 15 document cases, 7.5 linear feet. That's a massive historical footprint for one person's mission.
It really is.
So for you listening, thinking about this whole deep dive, this history of missionary radio, how it started, how it changed, how does that inform maybe how we think about tackling big challenges today? That balance between holding onto a core purpose, but being willing to embrace new tools, new methods.
Yeah, and maybe leave you with this final thought, pulled straight from the source material we looked at.
Mm.
Because a method is new does not necessarily mean it is wrong or unworthy of trial. And because a method is old and has proved useful for other days does not mean it remains useful now and should be preserved. It's a challenge, really, to constantly assess how we do things, be willing to change, even while staying true to why we're doing it. Something to think about.